At first, nothing about the screen felt unusual. It was just another late night, another bored scroll through channels, another low-budget true crime program playing quietly in the background. But for one man, that screen would become a doorway, one that didn't just show violence but seemed to invite it. The man lived alone, quiet job, quiet apartment, quiet life. The kind of person co-workers barely noticed and neighbors couldn't describe if asked. He wasn't known for anger or aggression. If anything, he blended in so well that people often forgot he was there at all. That invisibility mattered. Every night after work, he followed the same routine. Simple food, lights dimmed, television on. He preferred crime stories, murders, disappearances, psychological breakdowns. Not because they excited him, but because they felt familiar. Predictable, structured, unlike real life. One night, a program aired that changed everything. It was an old case, poorly reenacted. A killer who lived an ordinary life while hiding something far darker beneath the surface. The show focused heavily on psychology, how small thoughts, repeated often enough, could slowly reshape a person's identity. The camera lingered on quiet moments, reflections in mirrors, empty rooms, long silences. The man leaned closer to the screen without realizing it. For the first time, the story didn't feel like entertainment. It felt personal. The killer on the screen wasn't portrayed as a monster. He was calm, soft-spoken, methodical, invisible, and that disturbed the man more than any graphic violence ever could. That night, he dreamed vividly. He stood in a hallway that seemed endless, doors lining both sides. At the end of the hall, a screen glowed softly. He couldn't see what was playing, but he felt pulled toward it. With every step, the sound grew clearer, breathing, slow, controlled, familiar. He woke up unsettled, but not afraid. In the days that followed, he couldn't stop thinking about the program. He replayed scenes in his head, the way the killer spoke, the way he planned, the way he justified small actions before committing larger ones. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition. Soon, the man began watching similar content obsessively, not casually, analytically. He took mental notes, patterns, mistakes killers made, what led them to get caught, what signs people missed, what details investigators overlooked. At first it felt harmless, intellectual curiosity, but slowly, something changed. The screen stopped feeling like a barrier, it felt like a mirror. He started imagining how events would unfold if he were the one making decisions. Not violently, not emotionally, logically, cleanly, efficiently. The thoughts didn't shock him anymore. They settled in comfortably, like furniture rearranged in a room he'd lived in forever. Around this time, people noticed small changes. A co-worker mentioned his stare lingered too long. A cashier felt uneasy during a normal interaction. A neighbor reported hearing footsteps late at night in the hallway outside her door, stopping just short, then leaving without a sound. Nothing criminal, nothing provable, just wrong. The man began recreating scenes from the programs in harmless ways, standing in shadows, timing footsteps, watching reflections instead of faces, testing how long he could remain unnoticed in public spaces. He told himself it was curiosity, experimentation, but the screen kept feeding him ideas. One episode featured a killer who practiced by blending into crowds, learning how long it took for someone to notice they were being watched. The next day, the man tried it in a grocery store. He stood still at the end of an aisle, eyes fixed, expression neutral. It took nearly 3 minutes before someone felt uncomfortable enough to leave. That realization thrilled him and scared him. Late one night, something happened that crossed an invisible line. The man noticed his television screen wasn't reflecting the room the way it normally did. The dark glass showed his outline, but his face looked delayed, like his reflection was half a second behind his movements. He waved his hand. The reflection followed, slowly. He laughed it off. Old TV, bad lighting, but the feeling stayed. From then on, the screen felt alive. Not literally, but psychologically. Every story felt directed. Every narration seemed to speak to him specifically, When the narrator described a killer's internal thoughts, the words matched his own too perfectly. Sleep became difficult. When he did sleep, he dreamed of watching himself from a distance through windows, mirrors, screens, always calm, always controlled, always unseen. The scariest part wasn't the violence in his thoughts. It was how normal they felt. The screen no longer showed him stories. It showed him possibilities. And somewhere between fiction and fixation, the man stopped asking whether he could become someone dangerous and started wondering why he hadn't already. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened quietly, through repetition. The man stopped watching crime stories for entertainment and started using them as instruction. Not consciously at first, he told himself he was just studying human behavior, reactions, fear, patterns, but his attention had narrowed. He no longer cared about the victims or the aftermath. He focused on moments before when everything was still possible. He began rehearsing conversations in his head. Not arguments, just neutral exchanges, testing how much information someone would give without realizing it. How easily strangers filled silence, how quickly people trusted calm voices. The screen had taught him something important. Violence didn't start with action, it started with permission. And permission often came from the victim, without them knowing it. One night, while watching the reenactment of a home invasion case, he paused the screen at an unusual moment. The actor playing the killer stood in a doorway, half lit, unseen by the person inside the house. That still image unsettled him, not because it was threatening, but because it was quiet. He stared at it for a long time. Then he turned the TV off and stood in his own doorway, lights off behind him, hallway dim ahead. He watched his reflection in the dark screen across the room. This time, there was no delay, no distortion, just him. That night, he took a walk, later than usual. No destination, no goal. He moved slowly, deliberately, paying attention to how little noise he made. How easily he blended into the empty street. How invisible he felt. That feeling returned. The same one he'd felt watching the screen. Comfort. Over the next few weeks, his behavior grew more calculated. He adjusted his routine slightly each day. Left work earlier. Took different routes home. Stopped answering messages right away. Nothing alarming on its own. But together they created distance, space, privacy. The screen kept reinforcing the same lesson. The most dangerous people were never rushed. They waited. Then came the first moment he couldn't undo. It happened on an ordinary evening. Rain had just started to fall. The kind that muffles sound and blurs streetlights. He noticed someone ahead of him walking alone, distracted, unaware. He slowed his pace without thinking, matched distance, stayed just far enough back to remain unseen. He told himself he was only observing, but his thoughts were no longer hypothetical. They were procedural. How long before the person sensed him? What would make them turn around? What wouldn't? The answers surfaced effortlessly, like muscle memory. When the person finally glanced back, their eyes met his for just a second. He smiled politely, gave a small nod. Non-threatening, normal. They relaxed instantly. That reaction did something to him. It wasn't excitement, it was validation. He walked past them moments later, heart steady, pulse calm. And as he continued on, one thought repeated over and over in his mind. They never saw me. That night, the screen felt different again. Not reflective, not delayed, encouraging. The stories he watched seemed to slow down, focusing on details others ignored. Timing, positioning, opportunity. He began muting the narration and predicting what would happen next. Not the crime, but the human mistakes. He was almost always right. Sleep became optional. Food an afterthought. His world narrowed to observation and control. He stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing patterns, movements, habits, weak points. The first real incident wasn't violent. Not in the way crime stories usually are. Someone reported an attempted break-in nearby. No forced entry, no stolen items, just signs that someone had been there. Door unlocked, window disturbed. Nothing taken. The police dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The man watched the report on his screen that night. He didn't feel proud. He felt confirmed. From then on, escalation felt inevitable. Each step made the next one easier. The screen no longer inspired him. It justified him. Every story seemed to say the same thing in different ways. This has happened before. This is how it starts. This is normal. But the screen never showed endings clearly. When the final event happened, it wasn't dramatic. No chase, no struggle, just silence and control, and a moment that passed too quickly to feel real. The details would later confuse investigators. Nothing fit cleanly. No clear motive, no obvious mistake, except one. Afterward, the man returned home and turned on the television. He expected relief, resolution, some sense of completion. Instead, he felt empty. The screen showed nothing unusual. Just another crime program beginning. Another calm narrator, another familiar tone, and suddenly he understood something the screen had never explained. The stories never ended, because the screen needed them to continue. The man wasn't inspired by the screen. He had been shaped by it. Days later, when authorities questioned him, they noted how cooperative he was. How calm, how articulate. He answered every question, without hesitation. Too easily, as if he had rehearsed it. Because he had learned how these conversations went, how investigators thought, what they looked for, what they missed, all from the screen. When the case finally closed, people searched for warning signs, red flags, something obvious they could point to. They found none, just a quiet man, a quiet screen, and a story that felt disturbingly familiar. Because the most unsettling part wasn't what he did. It was how many people had watched the same stories, the same screens, the same calm explanations, and never noticed how thin the line really was. Between watching and becoming,